Hello, everyone. It is with my great pleasure to welcome you to the session on environmental and human impacts of nuclear weapons testing. I have been a great admirer of our three speakers, so I'm so pleased to be able to moderate this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I'm so pleased to introduce you to Arjun Makhijani, who's the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He holds a PhD from the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, where he specialized in nuclear fusion. He's authored and co-authored studies on a variety of energy, nuclear weapons, and nuclear waste issues. He's a principal editor of Nuclear Wastelands, a global guide to nuclear weapons production and its health and environmental effects from MIT Press. And he was elected a fellow of the American Physical Society in 2007. From 2004 to 2018, he served on a team to provide scientific support to the US presidentially appointed Advisory Board on Radiation and Worker Health. He's testified before Congress and been a consultant to several agencies of the United Nations. We're so pleased to have you, Arjun.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Fred, for inviting me. I really appreciate being here, and I've learned a lot from the other sessions. Yeah, so this is about U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands and Nevada test site. I just want to give you a summary of the tests. So 1,054 tests, 67 of them were in the Marshall Islands, but the megatonnage in the Marshall Islands atmospheric tests, 108 megatons plus, was more than about 100 times more than the megatonnage of the atmospheric tests at Nevada test site, about 100 of them. So the single Bravo test was 15 megatons, and the total 100 tests at Nevada test site were slightly over 1 megaton. So I just wanted to give you that perspective. The largest test done in the United States was in Alaska, a 5 megaton test in Alaska, in Amchitka. Okay, so it's important to look at the first test because it set the tone for what went wrong later that shouldn't have gone wrong, because a lot of things were learned at the first test. The chief of radiological safety was Colonel Stafford Warren. He was a medical doctor. He was later dean of UCLA, left his papers there, which is relevant. So he had a radiological survey team after the Trinity test and wrote a memo, which is referenced in the footnotes, to Colonel Groves about radiological conditions. He didn't admit that anybody got a dangerous dose, but this is what was measured. A house with a family about 20 miles from ground zero, 60 rads, over 6 weeks, no warning, no evacuation. An unoccupied hotspot had doses of more than 200 rads. The dust outfall, this is a quote, dust outfall from various portions of the cloud was potentially very dangerous hazard over a band of almost 30 miles wide, extending almost 90 miles northeast of the site. So this was, I would characterize this as a radiological disaster. If you have a, let's see, 2,700 square mile wide dangerous fallout, and fallout persisted for days, up to 200 miles at supposedly low levels, so extending quite far from the site. So looking at the results, he made this recommendation, which is relevant, which is why I wanted to talk about the Trinity test. It is this officer's opinion that this site was too small for a repetition of a similar test of this magnitude, except under very special conditions. And I would presume that the special conditions were like the Trinity test, secrecy, nobody should know. It is recommended that the site be expanded or a larger one, preferably with a radius of at least 150 miles without population, be obtained if this test is to be repeated. The test was about 25 kilotons. And of course, tests larger than that were done at both the Marshall Islands and the Nevada test site, especially at the Marshall Islands. I want to talk a little bit about the selection of the test sites. Admiral Blandy, World War II admiral, said, "We wish to acquire a few miserable islands of insignificant economic value, but one with the precious blood of America's finest sons to use as future operating bases. All that can be raised on most of these islands is a few coconuts, a little taro, and a strong desire to be somewhere else." Of course, the last part was quite a bit of presumption. On a personal note, I learned a lot from indigenous people in India and also in the United States. And it's amazing that anybody who knows indigenous people could say this, that they have a strong desire to be somewhere else, because they're the most connected to the land among the people that I know anyway. Site selection requirements, these are official, these are all from military documents. They're quoted in a book that IPPNW and IER did in 1991, also cited. It's available free for download. The site selection requirements, among others, were wind conditions so that there would be, quote, "no possibility of subjecting personnel to radiological hazards or surrounding land or water area to unintentional radioactive contamination." And that meteorological conditions should be understood so you could predict them. Conclusion of the military's investigation was the Marshall Islands in the main do not meet these meteorological requirements. And moreover, the 150-mile recommendation was also violated when basically Bikini and Eniwetok were selected as test site. And of course, these ignoring the meteorological conclusions and the 150-mile recommendation had severe consequences for the people who lived there. Selection of Nevada was similar. So the first tests after the war were, of course, done in the Marshall Islands. It was pretty expensive to do it. The Army, so the background is, Korean War, Army wanted its own weapons. They wanted to do a lot of testing. It was getting expensive, and so they wanted to go that far out, and so they wanted a test site in the continental United States. Military planners did an evaluation as usual. They were pretty good at it, actually. They did a good job. They thought between Cape Hatteras and Cape Fear on the coast of North Carolina would be a pretty good place because the fallout would blow over the Atlantic Ocean. They had some ecological reservations, interestingly, around the Gulf Stream, if I'm remembering correctly. But one of the main problems was it would have been difficult to condemn the land and acquire it for a nuclear test site because privately owned land. It was much more convenient to do it in Nevada, which was Western Shoshone land, so already controlled by the US military. The Western Shoshone, I've worked with some of them, and they said they have an 1863 treaty that, as I have understood, granted transit rights to the settlers going west, but no permanent occupation rights. And that is how I understand their view of, so they still feel they retain rights to that land. And the test site was located there because I don't know who said occupation is 90% of the law. I'll find that out after. So, there was a lot of hesitation, and, Fallout didn't have a very good reputation already in the United States. And the military documents actually wanted to make people comfortable with testing near their homes. This quote, "There appears to be a need for adequate education of the people of our country concerning the radiological hazards resulting from atomic explosions. This should be realistic in nature with the view to giving the public a correct understanding of this matter in order that the hysterical or alarmist complex now so prevalent may be corrected." And it goes on, there's actually further discussion until the public will accept the possibility of an atomic explosion within a matter of 100 or so miles of their homes. Establishment of a continental proving ground will be beset by substantial public relations and political difficulties. Now, you see this hysterical and alarmist complex they talk about, and locating the test site within 100 miles of people's homes. This is deliberate. St. George, I think, St. George, Utah, I think is about 90 miles from the test site. So this wasn't like this is convenient, we can really do it here. We are going to, the word re-education actually appears in the military documents. They're all quoted and cited in the book I mentioned. So at one point, there's a document that said something like part of the object is to make people comfortable with neutrons trotting around in their homes. So I'll go to the Marshall Islands tests first. They happened first. These are, so this is the Castle test series that I particularly want to talk about. I'll talk about Operation Crossroads and the Castle test series. So except for the Coon test, each one of these tests was much larger than all 100 tests at Nevada test site. This is something I think that should be common knowledge among the American people as to what they did to the trust territory under the United Nations mandate. So let me start with Operation Crossroads. A slide was in the wrong order, it should have been after this. So this is a photograph of the second test, Test Baker, near the end of July. It was a barge test and the bomb was under the barge. And there was a massive amount of water, contaminated, of course, with fission products that came raining. There were 84 target ships, and some Japanese captured target ships. They had animals on board and instruments, and 100 non-target ships. As I understand it, much or most of the Pacific Fleet was there. It was a coming out party for the bomb. 42,000 soldiers and sailors, dignitaries, diplomats, press. It was a big event. It actually was around the same time that President Truman's representative, Bernard Baruch, am I pronouncing his name correctly, Laura? Made a speech to the United Nations about disarmament, saying that no one should acquire nuclear weapons. The US would retain them and get rid of them when they were sure that no one had nuclear weapons, and that if anybody was caught trying, they would receive, quote, condign punishment, which I can only interpret that as a punishment with nuclear weapons. And these tests occurred around the same time. So this was kind of the disarmament notice of how the US is going to manage disarmament. That would be my interpretation, and I think anybody not in the United States would have been wise to interpret it that way. Okay, so there was the same, Stafford Warren also led a radiological safety team. The radiological safety people were not high on the totem pole of the military establishment. My assessment, looking at lots of early work in the 40s and 50s, is they did a pretty good job with the materials and instruments that they had. And they, the second test was a radiological disaster. Stafford Warren, after he passed away, left his documents to the UCLA Medical School, and I came by them through an atomic veteran and did a report with a colleague, and a lot of the documents are quoted in a report that we did in 1983 that was presented to Congress by Carl Morgan, who was one of the founders of health physics in the United States during the Manhattan Project. And so the general conditions were, you're not supposed to take the non-target ships into Bikini Lagoon. Bikini Lagoon was highly contaminated by the test, the second test especially. It had sodium-24. I know John Smitherman, who was a 17 or 18-year-old sailor, was one of the ships that was taken into the lagoon. And he jumped into the lagoon for a swim. It was hot, the water was nice. He had lymphatic, multi-MeV beta rays, multi-MeV gamma rays. And when he got sick, the US military did not recognize him. He had to go to Japan, ironically, to get treated. When he died, I testified on behalf of his widow before the Veterans Board, and I'm sorry to say that more than one of them was falling asleep as I was telling his story. So part of the problem was that the military personnel were not listening to the radiological safety folks. Like they told them, don't take the ships into the lagoon, things like that. And there was what one officer called the blind, hairy-chested approach to the matter of radiological safety with a disdain for the unseen hazard. Of course, the problem with radiation is that it is an unseen hazard, and that is a great difficulty. So these were the conditions and consequences. They didn't have instruments to measure plutonium in the field. And there were hot spots everywhere and extremely variable beta gamma ratios. Dozens of times more beta, sometimes hundreds of times more beta. There were contaminated places and hot spots. You can imagine the spray didn't come down uniformly. And so there were hot spots everywhere. All the ships, 100 ships were, essentially all the ships were taken. Men were sleeping on the decks. There are documents that I didn't cite here because I didn't have them handy, but to my memory, they were washing meat down with water from the lagoon. The distillation units were contaminated, and eventually Honolulu and San Francisco Harbor were contaminated from trying to clean up all of these ships in the Pacific Fleet. So these are quotes: contamination of personnel clothing, hands, and even food can be demonstrated readily in every ship in increasing amounts every day. So when these things became an issue in the late 70s and early 80s, the Defense Department commissioned their contractors to do evaluations. And the evaluation for Operation Crossroads internal doses were that they were essentially insignificant. When I saw the documents, there was no way that anybody could make a scientifically sound statement that they were essentially insignificant when everything in the document, including things like lethal doses might be lurking in various corners. Many lethal doses might be lurking in various places where there are high beta gamma ratios, not to speak of the beta and gamma radiation issues themselves. And this report was a turning point. I remember I was there. I didn't present the report, Carl Morgan did, but I do remember the Defense Nuclear Agency, maybe the chief of the Defense Nuclear Agency was there, and he was asked whether they had looked at these documents in coming to their conclusion. And as I recall, he said, we can't go looking in everybody's attic. Now, this is the document set of the chief of radiological safety, and the documents were at UCLA. Not everybody's attic. So I want to contrast the lessons that the military learned for warfare especially from Test Baker, with the hysterical and alarmist complex that the public was supposed to have about the dangers of radiation. So there was a joint task force evaluation of the military lessons to be learned from this first test series. And it's a very, very interesting document. And this is one of the quotes from it, that they thought that the radiological contamination and the psychological terror, and I do believe terror is a word that is used in the document, would be as important as the destructive effects of the bomb. And so here's one of the quotes. And I have to say that they wrote graphically, even poetically, about what would happen. quote, "We can form no adequate mental picture of the multiple disaster which would befall a modern city blasted by one or more bombs and enveloped by radioactive mists. Of the survivors in the contaminated areas, some would be doomed by radiation sickness in hours, some in days, some in years. But these areas, irregular in size and shape as wind and topography might form them, would have no visible boundaries. No survivor could be certain he was not among the doomed. And so added to every terror of the moment, thousands would be stricken with the fear of death and the uncertainty of the time of its arrival." So on the one hand, you want to re-educate the American public that radiation is not so bad, you're just being hysterical and alarmist. And on the other hand, we think that exploding a nuclear weapon in a port would cause, basically a population to be stricken with terror. This is connected with what I want, a message for physicists. So this is the Bravo test, many dramatic pictures of this tragic event. You won't be, this is not, so I want to point, is there a, what you may call it? If you look at the middle isopleth, this is the Bravo test cumulative fallout. That number, 55,000, is the cumulative fallout in disintegrations per minute per square foot to 8th of June, 1954. This is from the Bravo test alone. You can see fallout there's just one map. There was also fallout in Africa and so on, not shown. And I want to show you the next map, and this is from a 1955 report, official report. So they had gum film and radiation measurements in all the places where there are dots. That's Mexico City, that had the same level of fallout from the cumulative tests in the Castle series as the Marshall Islands did. And it's very clear the Marshall Islands had a lot of fallout all over. And that also is relevant, all over, not just the northern atolls. At the other end, there was a similar hotspot in Colombo. And fallout essentially all over the world. Of course, in the area of the test, there's the tragedy of Rongelap, and that is really well known. They were not evacuated for quite a long time. The cumulative doses are lethal and near lethal for somatic effects, malformations, aborted pregnancies, skin diseases, nausea, vomiting, all the prompt effects of radiation were felt there. They were evacuated after some time. I want to talk a little bit about US testing. I think I only have this one slide, but I want to linger on it a little bit. So in the early 80s, when the people of Utah started becoming very active, one of their representatives asked the National Cancer Institute to do a study of the impacts of testing at the Nevada test site. And the study was finished by the late 80s, but wasn't published until a lot of activists pressured them to publish. It was published in 1997. It was a pretty good study. They did, basically, they did thyroid doses only, contamination basically from iodine-131. And the most impact was where it rained out onto grazing grounds. So And then sheep and cattle. We usually talk about cattle, but sheep impact was bigger because they eat broad-leaved plants, and so they eat more radiation when there's fallout. And so milk all over the country was contaminated, but in rural areas where people thought they were living healthy lives and drinking fresh milk, those children were most affected, especially children. I'll show you a chart about that. The four most affected counties were in, 4 of the 5 most affected counties were in Idaho, and 1 was in Montana. To date, to my knowledge, I am the only outside scientist who has gone to the affected places in Idaho to tell them what happened. People said, you're a fool, these are really conservative countries, you're an environmentalist going to. I said, I'm just going to, I don't want anything from them. I'm not asking them to sign a petition or anything. I'm just saying, this is what happened. It's for a different day, but I think one of the most moving, or maybe the most moving public meeting I've ever had was in Chalice, Idaho, with 30 people. So about 3% of the population of the town showed up. Oh, the other thing I want to say about this is they did know that the milk would be contaminated from experiments that were done at Hanford. And they did nothing to protect the milk supply of the country. At the same time, Kodak threatened to sue the Atomic Energy Commission because their film was getting fogged from being packed in agricultural corn husks, I think. And the AEC gave advance notice about predicted fallout so photographic film could be protected, but did nothing to protect the children. Okay, so lots of dose estimates, comparatives. So doses in the Marshall Islands were much higher than in the United States. And they affected, fewer people, but if you take proportion of the population, the equivalent number of cancers in the United States for proportion of the population would have been in the millions. And thyroid cancers in the United States are estimated somewhere between 11,000 and 200,000 and 212,000. Obviously, I think it's pretty obvious that most of the health ill effects, or many of the health ill effects, came from the displacement, the diet, the loss of jobs, the loss of traditional occupations, and so on. So these are the residual radioactivity estimates. I won't dwell on them. So remediation was tried. About 100,000 cubic yards of radioactive dirt was collected and dumped. Now, it was dumped in an unlined nuclear test crater. It was an 18-kiloton test that undoubtedly shattered a good bit of the subsurface of the island, Rooney Island. And the dirt was dumped. There was also dirt from the Nevada test site that was brought there for good measure. Of course, in my opinion, it would have been leaking from the start because the ocean waters, tides are flowing in and out of this thing. And now the Department of Energy has admitted that it's leaking and nobody knows what to do. Should the waste belong to those who created it? It's an important policy question, I think, that should talk about. So Beer 7, we compiled data from the Beer 7 National Academy's report. You can see the impacts on children, especially girl children, are many times what they are on grown-ups. What we haven't talked about yet is impacts during pregnancy. I've looked at this issue in more recent years, and impacts during the first trimester, teratogenic impacts, early failed pregnancies, miscarriages, malformations. And there's Hiroshima and Nagasaki data that says severe mental retardation, which is used in the documents as a medical term, has no threshold for impact based on the children of pregnant women during those bombings who survived. All right, so in the US, there's been a Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for some areas. But the Trinity test downwinders, even though, in my opinion, it was a radiological disaster, have not yet been compensated, and the high fallout, iodine fallout areas also haven't been compensated. Marshall Islands, of course, is a very fraught history. There was a tribunal created during the independence. The Marshall Islands became independent in the 1980s. The money that was allocated has been disbursed. There are billions of dollars of unfulfilled claims awarded by the tribunal. And one of the most important things is the U.S. has only recognized the four atolls in the north as affected when it has been clear, including by U.S. government scientists, that the entire Marshall Islands have been affected. They have no cancer treatment. They were treated like experimental subjects in good measure. And this is a quote from the AAC Committee on Biology and Medicine about medical examinations of the Marshall Islands. While it is true that these people do not live, I would say, as Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless true to say that they are more like us than the mice. And the mice explicitly refer to experimental mice. I know this by happenstance because we omitted the word "the" in the first edition of the book, and the author of these words called us to say that we had not properly reproduced the text. This is the last slide. My closing thought is there's good reason for the public not to trust official radiation science. The mistrust has been richly earned. I have given you a small slice of it, but an important and graphic slice of it. I'm very glad that the humanitarian impacts are at the heart of the TPNW. I think the most enduring nuclear weapons treaty is the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which is really an environmental and health treaty. At least President Kennedy treated it that way. And a lot of great people like Linus Pauling and Barry Commoner were there to ensure that it was so. So I think I will close by saying that the nuclear establishment has earned the distrust of the public. The role for independent science, the need for independent science is very great in these matters which normally we don't. So I learned, nuclear fusion, but I'm more or less self-educated in, with some good mentors in health physics. And so this is something we should think about as the American Physical Society, whether we should not cultivate truly independent, trustworthy science for the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really provoking talk. We could take questions. Please take them at the microphones because this is being recorded. Go ahead.
So thank you, Arjun. That was a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. If you could go back, I think it's the most recent graph, So why are the females so much more affected than the males at every age?
I don't know a good answer to this. It's not for every cancer. So there are some cancers for which males are more affected, but this is sort of when you group all the cancers together, solid cancer especially. I suspect from having looked at some data, but not a definitive answer, there's the hormonal differences between men and women, and maybe our body compositions, different amount of water, different amount of fatty tissue, all of these kinds of things probably, because there's clearly a gender difference in a biological gender difference in the cancer risk. Right? And this was new in Beer 7. In Beer 5, they didn't see this so much. Beer 5, the difference between males and females on average was just 5%. But Beer 5 did not look at age-dependent risk. Beer 7 looked at age-dependent risk, where it's most. So if you look at 40 years, it's not a big difference.
Thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to talk a little bit about compensation by the United States. So whenever there's the issue of the need for a compensation is raised by the Marshallese, the United States argues that the COFA that you mentioned in your slides as well is something that has been negotiated and signed. So the only thing that the Marshallese can really do is to halt those negotiations, which they did in 2022. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where those negotiations are at right now, and if there is anything other than that, given that this framework has been signed and the United States keeps arguing that anything related to the Marshall Islands has to be within that framework. Is there anything else that activists can advocate for in the United States?
Well, activists are advocating. I've worked with concerned scientists and Arms Control Association to kind of try to lay out some of the landscape in this. And there has been a memorandum of understanding, but I don't know that it is generally accepted yet in the Marshall Islands. The United States says this is going to be the framework, there's the amount of money, but it's not yet fully negotiated. So, and I don't have the most recent, the amounts of money that are being talked about, in my opinion, are completely inadequate. I've laid out a list of necessary things that money would be needed for. And yeah, if you do studies and say X is needed and then don't supply the money, I don't know which is worse, doing the study and not supplying the money or not. And now the Marshallese, like other Pacific countries, have more leverage because of the US-China conflict. It's the most unfortunate way to have leverage, but they do have it. And I think there are some pretty vigorous negotiations going on. So, I mean, yeah, we've tried to kind of say that the issues are very big and try to lay the technical issues out on the table. There's a public letter, as you know, that Daryl and Lily drafted that I helped with and so on. So we're doing what we can to focus attention on this issue rather than saying, it's sort of a US-China issue. It's really a US Marshall Islands issue. That's how it should justly be seen. Thank you.
Let's give Dr. Makhrijani another round of applause. I am, again, so pleased to introduce you to our next speaker. Dr. Tagjan Kasyanova is a Washington, D.C. based senior fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research, SUNY Albany, and a non-resident fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's an expert on nuclear politics and financial crime prevention. She currently works on issues related to proliferation financing controls, exploring ways to minimize the access of proliferators to the global financial system. From 2011 to 2015, Dr. Kasyanova served on the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Kasyanova is the author of Atomic Step, How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb, issued by Stanford University Press, a recent book, 2022. I hope that you will buy it and read it. And so please, let's welcome Dr. Kasyanova.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a little bit unusual to feel a little bit stupid, being among a real scientist, because I'm a political scientist and political science is not even a science. But I'm really grateful for the invitation and for the chance to give you a little bit background on the legacy of Soviet nuclear testing in Kazakhstan. And I think it's logical that I follow Arjun's excellent presentation because it's really disturbing, but also telling how similar nuclear powers had been in how they chose where to test nuclear weapons. So the Soviet government, similar to other nuclear powers, they chose land in eastern Kazakhstan with no consideration for local people or the environment. If you read the Soviet period documents, the explanation or their decision-making would be very pragmatic, non-emotional, and often it would be not based on real facts. For example, it was a real fact that there was good access to construction materials, sand, or water, but they would also call the land uninhabited, which was not true because there were thousands of people living exactly on the land which would be used for nuclear tests. Not to mention there was actually a major city not far away, only 75 miles away. So the tests continued for 40 years, and the Soviet military conducted, just at this site alone, more than 450 nuclear tests. And the program was completely secretive. Everything was conducted with no information shared, not only with the local people, but also with the local government of Kazakhstan. So basically, Moscow was deciding the fate of people in Kazakhstan. What appeared as this, empty, barren land to the Soviet planners was treasured ancestral land to Kazakhs. And this is where I hear, it's really painful to hear the stories of other communities, because that's exactly what people of Kazakhstan went through, that the land which they absolutely loved, and Kazakhs have very strong affinity for the place where they were born, where their ancestors were buried and so on, that it was seen in a completely different light by Soviet planners. But this specific region, it was of extra special value to Kazakhs, and I'll explain why. For some reason, this was the region that produced Kazakhstan's most famous poets, writers, educators. It was really a place of interaction of different cultures, European, Central Asian. It was also the site of a short-lived autonomous Kazakh government when Tsarist Russia was already dominating the region. And the major city of Semipalatinsk, now called Semey, was only 75 miles away. At the time when the Soviets chose the site, the population of Semipalatinsk was already 150,000 people, and it would grow double the size during the period of the Soviet testing program. So the test continued for 40 years, and the lack of care about the locals came through and manifested very vividly in how decisions were taken on when to conduct nuclear tests, and also in how the narratives were constructed around the nuclear testing program. There are so many testimonies from that period, from the survivors and victims, and I think this quote really summarizes how people of the region felt. And I want to give just one example, which to me shows the lack of care about the local people. It was in 1953, just before the Soviet military was ready to test a thermonuclear device. In a rush to equalize with the United States, the Soviet scientists, including the father of this device, Sloikov, Leokhey, Sakharov, he would also describe in his memoirs that until the last minute, we actually didn't give any thought to the question of fallout. And it's only, somebody, a mid-level scientist from the Ministry of that controlled the nuclear program, at the last minute he raised this question, because it was clearly that the fallout would be much more powerful than during the previous tests. And nobody thought about it until the last moment, and so they had a choice. They could either delay the test and think of a safer method to do it. For example, dropping the device from a plane instead of from a tower, or they could evacuate the locals. And they decided that they didn't want to delay the test, and so in a rush, they started evacuating people. Hundreds of army trucks drove thousands of locals away from their homes and hundreds of thousands of livestock to what was considered to be safer areas, although it was questioned later on. One witness described a scene of confusion. Why? Where? Neither the soldiers nor the shocked locals knew. Panic reigned in the steppe. Bewildered people waited for something terrible to happen. And that just shows that, imagine you are living your life, you have all this livestock, and suddenly military appear, they tell you to pack everything up and to go, and you don't even know whether you would be able to come back. And this test and many others, they resulted in contamination, but also even in physical injuries. Cases of glass falling at the meat factory in Semipalatinsk, or in hospitals, ceilings falling on the people who were already ill from some other diseases, and or people even sometimes dying when they were trying to hide in a shelter. If you look at this photo, at the black and white photo, you would think that you're looking at a child, but it's actually a young woman. She was 16 at the time when this photo was taken. She stopped growing. The person on the color photo was born this way. He had to live his entire life like that, completely dependent on his mother as a caregiver. This is a testimony from somebody who I met, who lived in a small settlement near the nuclear testing site. She actually became later on an activist, and she helped local women to get screening for breast cancer. But you can read her testimony and see that locals didn't even know why certain things were happening to them. I regularly heard stories from locals that when they were kids, they would also encounter animals with very visible physical issues, missing like limbs or stuff like that. So did anybody care? Did anybody monitor health of these people or try to treat them? And the story there is that there was some small-scale monitoring going on, but it was done only for military purposes. So Moscow would send some expeditions staffed by military doctors, and sometimes they would also add some civilian doctors from the Semipalatinsk region. And so, now there is limited exposure of those documents. You can find some in the archives. And I found documents which were written by the same organization, based on the same data from the same expedition, and the documents or reports for internal use would say, yes, there is contamination, it exceeds the norm by that number, I don't know, the grain is 60 times higher than norm of contamination. But in communication to local governors, these people would lie, and they would say, contamination levels do not exceed those allowable for special sanitary zone. The story about the contaminated milk, it just made me remember a story about contaminated grain. What did Soviet authorities do when they realized some of the grain was highly contaminated? They ordered for this grain not to be exported overseas, and they said just distribute it across the country so that it's not too visible. And I just find it so appalling that that's the kind of decisions they were making. The military also created a civilian facility in the city of Semipalatinsk, and they called it anti-brucellosis clinic. And so that clinic was established specifically with the purpose of collecting data on the health of locals. And they observed 10,000 people. And then they also had a control group of people living in another region. This clinic had 10 to 15 hospital beds. It just shows that nobody was planning to treat these people. They would only come in and be, tested, and their blood would be drawn, and that would be it. There was only one expedition that was staffed with people from within Kazakhstan. It's actually amazing that this was allowed, but this was possible only for a very short period of time. And it was led by the Institute of Regional Pathology, which was under the umbrella of the Kazakh Academy of Sciences. And thankfully, it was the Soviet health minister. There was a woman at the time who headed the ministry. She authorized that expedition. And so this group of local doctors from Kazakhstan, they went to the area. They did it for 3 years, and they would do studies of people, animals, and soil. And so they collected lots of clinical data. Maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe their methodology wasn't perfect, but they had enough data to fill in 12 volumes of findings. The findings were classified by the Soviet government immediately, and then there was a special conference behind the closed doors in Moscow where these local doctors from Kazakhstan were put together with the military doctors from the Institute of Biophysics in Moscow. And if you read the transcript of this conference, the entire conference is about these Soviet military doctors telling Kazakh doctors that you did everything wrong, your methodology is suspicious, and your people are having health issues because their hygiene is poor or they're not receiving enough vitamin C. So complete denial that radiation had anything to do with it. And shortly after, the expedition was shut down under pressure from the Soviet government. And so for 40 years, it kind of felt that nothing could be done, and people continued to get sick, they continued to die. Very high cancer rates, blood diseases, stillbirths, miscarriages, babies born with the Down syndrome, and also suicides. I've talked to one local, a Kazakh man, and he explained, he said initially, due to Islamic tradition, we didn't bury people who died by suicide at the regular cemetery. We buried them separately. But then there were so many of them that we decided to call it polygon disease. Polygon is the Russian word for the intestine side. And we started burying them with everyone. The person who conveyed this story, he alone has several people in his immediate environment who died by suicide, including his 9th grade son. And so, this horrific period lasted for 40 years. And there were some attempts by prominent Kazakhs to bring attention to this issue, and they would either be fired or silenced. And then finally, in the 80s, a combination of macro-political factors at the Soviet level and the processes that were happening within Kazakhstan, they combined and created a perfect storm for an anti-nuclear movement to become possible. What was happening at the Soviet level, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, allowed some freedom, and also allowed environmental organizations to function. Within Kazakhstan, there was really this resurgence of nation building or reclaiming national identity. I'm Kazakh, I'm from Kazakhstan, and I, for example, only now I'm making an effort to learn Kazakh because even your own language was suppressed. There were no schools that taught in your own language. if you were from a non-Russian republic. And so in the 80s, you observe this surge of kind of reclaiming agency over your own destiny. And then there was an event that was the last drop. And that was an underground nuclear test, because atmospheric tests were already banned by then, which resulted, as was often the case, in venting of radioactive gases. And usually nobody paid attention to that. But on that occasion, the contamination levels were so high, and the nearby military settlement, not the settlement that controlled the testing site, but the settlement with Soviet heavy bombers. The military commander of that settlement decided not to hide this information from the local governor. He confirmed to him that, yes, I ordered my people not to come to the canteen and not to go, for kids not to go to the kindergarten because our devices are showing high levels of contamination. And so this information became public, including, it became known to a famous Kazakh writer who was also the member of the equivalent of the Soviet parliament at the time, Olzhas Suleimanov. And so basically he called on people to come first to a rally in Almaty, back at the time the capital of Kazakhstan, and then it grew into this massive public anti-nuclear movement. And it's a really wonderful and powerful story of how regular people were really reclaiming agency over their own land. I also want to mention that Kazakhs had help from US peace activists. People from the Shoshone tribe would come to Kazakhstan, the Downwinders from Nevada, Hibakusha from Japan, and so there was this mutual support, but also inspiration. And the movement even had the name Nevada Semipalatinsk because from the very start, Kazakhs wanted to show that they're in this together with others outside of Kazakhstan. And so for 2 years, the anti-nuclear movement staged rallies and protests, and then it became possible for Kazakhstan's leadership to shut down the site even before the Soviet Union formally collapsed. I want to talk briefly about studying the impact of nuclear tests after Kazakhstan gained independence. So when I worked in the archives in Kazakhstan for my book, I found numerous official requests from the early 90s from the Kazakh government addressed to different Russian ministries, basically asking, begging them for information on the civilian medical files, because they wanted to understand what happened and, you know, where the fallout was and anything that would help them understand what happened on their own land. I didn't come across any responses from Russia. So what the Kazakh Institute of Radiation Medicine and Ecology did, and that was established on the basis of that infamous anti-brucellosis clinic, they only had some data because a lot of documents were either removed to Russia or destroyed altogether. What they were able to look at were the names from those 10,000 people that were monitored during the Soviet period. And so they actually could see now, you know, they could do the not the statistics, but check the official data on when these people died and from what. And their conclusion was that compared to people in other regions of Kazakhstan, those who live near this testing site face significantly high risks of general and cancer-related mortality. And they also looked at second and third generations of parents exposed to certain doses, and also could tell that there were some chromosome aberrations among them. So, I'm obviously not a medical doctor, and I'm not a specialist on ionizing radiation. So what I can add is just 2 personal observations from my trips to the areas next to the former testing site. I go there regularly. And my 2 observations are the following. It's very hard to meet truly elderly people. And my second observation is that I see too many children who have visible health issues. So I don't even know about those that I cannot see, but I can, for example, share that, on one trip, I go to a family, there is a young mother, she has a baby, the baby is 6 months, and on one of his hands, he has 6 fingers. And then immediately after, I go to another family, and it's a family that originally had 6 daughters. 1 died at the age of 6, and then we meet the youngest 2, and one of them already went through 2 years of chemo because she had facial bone cancer. Thankfully, she survived. She has other health issues, but no cancer. And then the youngest girl in that family, she's missing 4 fingers from one of her hands. And it just a small settlement. And basically when I meet those children, who would be now the 4th generation, I'm just thinking about my other part, the other part of my job, and that, and my exposure to all these conversations in New York or Geneva or Vienna somewhere, and how, the diplomats and policymakers are sitting around, with intelligent faces and talking about nuclear deterrence or how nuclear weapons bring security. And I just cannot connect those 2 images in my own head. It's just, I think, despicable that we're not talking enough about the price that was already paid by Marshallese, by all the others and Kazakhs, and more importantly, about the price that they're continuing to pay. So I'll stop here.
Well, thank you so much for such a really personal and powerful account. I really appreciate that. And I imagine we have some questions, comments for Dr. Kasyanova. Thanks, and we have 5 minutes.
Kazakhstan is now a sovereign country, and the other day the Russians aimed a test ICBM missile launch into Kazakhstan. I'd just like to know what the government thinks about that.
Mm-hmm. So the question is about an ICBM test launched from the Russian territory, from Kapustin Yar, and the part of the MOK warhead ended at the Legacy military testing site in Kazakhstan. So just for some context, to show you where Kazakhstan is coming from. Kazakhstan gave up the 4th largest nuclear arsenal left from the Soviet period. Not only did it agree that the Soviet weapons would be moved to Russia, but it also gave up on highly enriched uranium and destroyed nuclear weapons infrastructure, including at the testing site. Kazakhstan also joined the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone that has additional commitments and prohibitions that Kazakhstan took upon itself, including signing the additional protocol. And it was one of the first to sign the TPNW, one among the first 50 to ratify. So when the negotiations for TPNW were going on, Kazakhstan's position was that it really argued that there should be a clear definition of a nuclear weapon. It also argued that transit should be prohibited due to the fact that some parties were rushing to complete the treaty that was left. So we have some ambiguity in the text of the treaty itself. But there is a prohibition to assist, which, while the prohibition, the word assist is not clearly defined. Some might say that if you allow a nuclear weapon state to work on its nuclear-capable missile, that you might be assisting. But I do want to reiterate here the pattern of Kazakhstan's actions, number one, and number two, that there are some ambiguities that are present in the treaty itself. Having said that, as somebody who is coming from Kazakhstan, I wish there were no military testing grounds that would be leased to Russia. This is something, it's a legacy provision, and the government of Kazakhstan is gradually moving towards reducing the territory that is allowed to be leased. And I know that Kazakhstan is actively discussing this issue with Russia. It's also always, because it's not the first time that it happens, at least in the past, the official position of Kazakh government was that it's ready to discuss this during the technical meetings of the member state parties of TPNW. So just overall, obviously, Kazakhstan is moving in the right direction, but I want to urge anyone who is so quick to demand so much and immediately from Kazakhstan to first of all remember about geopolitics. Kazakhstan shares the longest porous border with Russia. There are some still legacy issues that are being resolved gradually. And moreover, if you look at the record of Kazakhstan, it's definitely, has done more than enough for disarmament. And so, whenever I have this conversation with my colleagues, I just try for them to see it in the context that there are certain issues that cannot be decided as fast as would be preferable to all of us who care about this.
Hi, thank you very much. Mainly, I just wanted to thank you for this compelling talk and the stories you shared with us. My question, I would just be interested to hear more about the scientific community in Kazakhstan, how they organize, on this issue, and it would just be interesting to hear more.
So, I'm not part of the scientific community. From what I see from the outside is that it's still a little bit siloed and dispersed. The Kazakhstan Institute for Radiological Medicine and Ecology is considered to be the primary institution, both for research but also for actual medical help. They would be the ones, for example, who would decide if a person can be considered formally a victim of nuclear tests. They would also be the ones authorizing medical treatment provided by the government to victims and survivors. My unscientific perception as a policy scholar is that there hasn't been a comprehensive study of neither the environment nor population. And there are, kind of smaller scale, for example, checking for something in this specific village or checking this group or, checking something on thyroid. But I don't think the issue has received enough attention from the scientific community so far.
For now, let's give another round of appreciation. And we have one more panelist, last but certainly not least. We're so glad to welcome Dr. Sébastien Philippe, who is a research scholar and lecturer with the Princeton University Program on Science and Global Security, part of the School of Public and International Affairs. His research focuses on nuclear weapons, arms control, disarmament, and justice issues. He's a co-author of Toxique from the French University Press, published 2 years ago, an investigation into the radiological and environmental impact of French nuclear tests in the Pacific, which was a finalist for the 2021 Albert Londres Prize, which is the French equivalent of the Pulitzer, and won a 2022 Sigma Award for Best Data Journalism in the World, among other accolades. Dr. Philippe holds a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton, was a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at Harvard, and has served as a nuclear weapons system safety engineer in France's Ministry of Armed Forces. In 2023, he was appointed as a member of the Scientific Advisory Group of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we're so pleased to have you here, Dr. Philippe. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today. Thank you for the Forums on Physics and Society for the invitation. Today, I want to talk about my work on reconstructing population exposure from past nuclear tests. And it's really a pleasure to be on such a great company today on this panel. And what I'd like to share with you is kind of what I see as part of a new wave of academy and scientific and technical work on this issue to come up with independent answers to a lot of questions that are still pending on the impact of those tests all around the world. So this is the world map showing all the places where nuclear weapons have been tested. And since 1945, there has been over 2,056 nuclear tests worldwide. The last ones took place in North Korea. Out of those 2,056, 528 were atmospheric tests and led to nuclear fallouts. The story of nuclear testing is the story of continued story of colonialism in the 20th century, and all the places where nuclear weapons were tested were in communities that had pretty much little say or agency in preventing those tests from happening there. And despite being 75 years or more in the nuclear age, we still don't know the full impact of those tests on all downwind communities in many countries around the world. Now, there has been work, and our first speaker today talked about it. There has been a lot of work in trying to reconstruct the radiological impact on those tests, where fallout led to deposition on radionuclides on the ground and so on. And what is considered, in some sense today, one of the gold standard in terms of studies was done by the National Cancer Institute here in the United States, which reconstructed fallout deposition all across the continental US. What is amazing when you look at those maps, they seem to be pretty accurate to a certain to a pretty good geographical degree. But while the study produced deposition data for over 3,000 counties in the US, in reality, the underlying measured data represent only less than 3% of the total data set. So even in places where we have what we can still consider significant information about fallout deposition, it's still very little, and it's extremely hard to capture the full extent of what happened back then. And where there is no or very little data available on what fell to the ground and what people were exposed to, and the contamination of the food chain, and how that increased the risk of cancers for downwind communities. Researchers, starting in the early 2010s, and so proposed to use more modern atmospheric transport models to reconstruct population exposures. And so when I started working on this a few years, 4 years ago now, this is the literature from which I started working from. And the idea really is to use atmospheric transport modeling, together with our basic understanding of nuclear weapons, explosions physics, and data about size and composition of nuclear mushroom clouds, together with historical weather data, to reconstruct which area were impacted by fallout, compute air concentration, deposition on the ground, and eventually those rates to assess radioactive doses to the public. So my case study today for you, which has been the bulk of my work so far, is reconstructing the legacy of French nuclear testing in the Pacific. So France, just like the United States and the United Kingdom, tested nuclear weapons in the Pacific. The key reason for the government was that this was a faraway and empty space. And of course, it was far away from mainland France, but it was certainly not empty. And France started testing nuclear weapons there in 1966, after it had lost control of its nuclear test site in Northern Africa after Algerian independence. France conducted 46 atmospheric tests from 66 to 74, many of them taking place after the partial test ban treaty had entered into force between the US, UK, and the Soviet Union, at a time where it was well known that those tests and fallouts were impacting the public. This project that I worked on was dubbed the Murara Files, and I will tell you why in a little bit. This was essentially the first independent assessments of the radiological consequences of French nuclear testing in the area. Our goal were to independently study the health and environmental consequences using primary sources, and at the same time peer review the existing government studies. And one particular goal for us was to shed light on the existing victim compensation legislation that was in force at the time and identify possible shortcomings. And one of the reasons was that France enacted a law in 2010 to compensate victims from nuclear testing. And for the first 7 to 8 years, the claim rejection rate was over 97%. So legislators were really wondering, what was going on here. It was relatively easy for the government to reject claims. So we combined scientific research, and what was kind of very unusual with this project is we also teamed up with a team of investigative journalists to leverage open source analysis, interviews, legal analysis, scholarly research, simulation of radioactive fallouts, and to verify existing retrospective dosimetric computations. Over 12 people worked on that project for 2 years. And we, eventually had significant results to show for all this work. The real starting point for the project, and this is why it was called the Murara Files. Murara is the atoll where French tested most of those weapons in the Pacific. And civil society groups that were representing victims from the public, but also veterans victims, had sued the French government to have access to the historical radiological surveys that were done at the time, which were not public for decades. And in 2013, they won part of their lawsuits, and 200 documents were declassified. Those documents arrived in boxes. They were all, print out, essentially. And it's a long story, but they got lost for 7 years until they ended up on one of my colleague computer and on mine while I was doing my postdoc at Harvard. And as someone who had worked for the French government on nuclear safety of nuclear weapon system, when I saw the documents for the first time, I kind of understood that there was something quite amazing in that small archive. Those were essentially the measurements for contamination on the ground, but also in all of the food chain for not all, but many of the tests that France had conducted. So I used those documents and peering out data from them about the composition of French nuclear mushroom clouds in the Pacific, altitude of those clouds, and so on, and used archive-graded weather data into iSplit, which is a software developed by NOAA, to reconstruct the fallout from those tests and compare my results to government predictions since the 1960s. So this is the explosion from the first French test in the Pacific, codenamed Aldebaran, after one of the stars that you could see in the skies from the test site. It took place on July 2, 1966. And from video footage and the archival data, we reconstructed the mushroom cloud's dimensions. It just takes a minute. And break down those clouds into particles of different size and different activities, and use that archived weather to show that the fallout had indeed directly impacted one of the closest communities that was living to the test site, called the Gambier Archipelago. This test is really emblematic about nuclear testing in the 20th century. This was the first test. It was meant to be celebrated. There was a French official who was visiting that island to celebrate the test with the locals. He got not a phone call because we didn't have, of course, cell phones at the time. But he got communication from the Navy saying the fallout was actually coming towards the island. And he was exfiltrated from the island with his team. And they didn't tell the local people living there that this was coming up. And people kept partying, celebrating the test. And everybody was contaminated. Everything was contaminated. Groundwater, food, pretty much everything. After the test, the Navy, because the French Navy was in charge of this at the time, dispatched the medical doctor that was in charge of surveying contamination of the environment. It took 4 days for the small ship to arrive on site. And they obviously started doing measurements and realized that everything was contaminated, even people's clothes, every local source of water, because in those areas, and especially in French Polynesia at the time, for the people who were living near the test site, the primary source of drinking water was rainwater for many of them. Sometimes directly collected from the roof of their houses and collected in cisterns where all family members would drink from. The recommendation from the radiological survey team, which was headed by this doctor, was to minimize the actual numbers to avoid losing the confidence of the population. This document was part of the archive that was declassified at the time. beyond that recommendation, the government actually decided to simply not tell the population and to not tell them for over 30 years until the French test site pretty much closed down in 1996 after the last test series. 55 years later, so this is part of the work I've done with my colleague Thomas Statius when we wrote our book. As I mentioned, this was kind of unusual. It was a book written by a scientist and an investigative journalist. And Thomas, after I'd done all my reconstruction and so on, was investigating the matter, went to Polynesia, and managed to get a document from the Polynesian government, which for the first time 50 years later recognized that there was a direct link between that radioactive fallout at that time and excess cancers in Polynesia, and in particular excess thyroid cancers. That document was published at the same time of all the rest of our studies, and was an absolute bombshell for local politics, because the local government, of course, was aware of this. And this was not, written by anyone. It was written by a French military doctor. So internally, the French government had data about clusters of cancers. When we had asked for that data to see if it existed, we were told it did not exist and it was not available. And of course, we found that this was not the case. So we did this for not just the first test, but for many other tests, and in particular for key tests where the French government already had mentioned that accident had happened and population had been exposed more significantly than in other cases. Here we peered through all the studies that had been made, and using that archive, which was essentially the primary sources that government scientists had used to compute doses to the public, we found that there were a few significant mistakes when adding up would systematically underestimate doses to the public by orders of 2 to 10. On top of this, we were able to reconstruct the path of the radioactive cloud of the 1974 Centaur tests. This is one of the last French atmospheric tests in the region. And again, what happened at the time was that according to military documents, the mushroom cloud height was much less than expected. And at the moment of the test and the altitude at which the cloud stabilized, the winds were blowing towards the northwest and towards the most inhabited islands of Polynesia, which is Tahiti, and all the other nearby islands that where more than 90% of the total population at the time was living. Reconstructing this test and the impact on islands for which there is no official data at this point, and reevaluating doses to the public on the island of Tahiti, we found that 90% of the French Polynesian population was exposed to dose above the current threshold to be compensated under French law. This is 10 times more people than what was believed before our work. So based on all of this reassessments, this is what we found. As I mentioned, we found that the pool of eligible claimants could be increased by a factor of 10, even under the current existing laws, and that maximum doses to the public were significantly underestimated. We still don't have all the primary sources for all the tests, all the surveys that were done, even if things are moving in the right direction, there is still no comprehensive assessment of that impact. When we launched this project, it was March 2021. It was during the pandemic. The project launched as a book, which is only in French so far, but is full of not only anecdotes, but other key findings that I've not presented today on the politics, legal, and scientific issues here. One of them, for example, is that the French government always claimed that all of its studies had been peer-reviewed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, in Vienna, and we found that this was not the case. And so there are plenty of claimants who were for which their claims were rejected on pretty much what accounts for, falsification of the scientific peer review process. The scientific results and methodology were published in peer-reviewed journals. All of this is publicly available and to anyone, including the public. So this project came out in March 2021 and had a pretty big policy impact, I would say. There was direct legislative and parliamentary response in France. A bill was introduced at the National Assembly. Some members of parliament, especially representing Polynesia, wanted a parliamentary inquiry. I testified at the National Defense Commission. Unfortunately, all the hearings were behind closed door and not public. The French government, the Polynesian government started a Truth and Justice working group and sent a delegation to Paris. There are talks that happened in June of 2021 over several days involving the French health minister, overseas ministers, and defense minister. But eventually, the matter was so politically sensitive and important that it was President Macron who decided to intervene and essentially decide what the government response would be. So Macron came to Polynesia for a 3-day presidential visit in 2021 in July. And his keynote speech, he recognized that France owed a debt to Polynesia, and for the first time rebutted the myth of clean tests. So the French national narrative was that the tests had always been clean and population were not impacted. And he clearly said that this was not the case. He made 3 promises to improve compensation for local population, to give more access to archives. In fact, I will say a little bit more, but he said that we should have access to any archives that is related to French nuclear testing in Polynesia. And finally, call for additional environmental remediation. So right now, access is improved for local population, although it focused primarily on the subsets of claimants, which were the most exposed community. Ultimately, our studies find that over 10,000 cancer victims could be concerned under current legislation, and there are many ongoing litigations in French courts. There is no class action lawsuit under French law, and so therefore everyone has to sue the government one by one. And we've been writing amicus brief for that purpose. Access to historical documents has dramatically changed. The French government has reviewed already 100,000 of documents, and more than 60,000 can now be consulted at the National Archives and the archives of the Ministry of Armed Forces. So we started with 200, and we have now hundreds times more, and I could probably spend my lifetime trying to read all of them, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to rely on others and other scholars, historians that are starting to peer through all those documents. Institutional contributions to this effort are unfortunately extremely heterogeneous. There are particular institutions that still refuse to open their archives. And finally, one key demand still by impacted communities was to continue cleaning up, or simply to clean up, the remnant of the nuclear testing enterprise. And so new cleaning efforts started in 2021, and there are of course still questions about where to store and process some of those wastes, and in the long-term status of the atolls on which all those tests took place. So what is next after this kind of projects? Well, you know, one thing we can think about, and this is another video, but I'm running out of time. We now essentially have, I think, technical capabilities and weather data archives that are precise enough in terms of spatial and temporal frequencies so that we can try to remap worldwide nuclear fallouts from pretty much any countries in the world, as long as we gather enough data on each test. We can, in particular, reconstruct population exposure where it is the least documented or sometimes not documented. And this is from one of those declassified French documents that I mentioned, where not only France was tracking, of course, the fallouts from its test all around the world and in the northern and southern hemisphere, but would also capture fallouts from here, Chinese tests that were taking place in Xinjiang, and for which we have very to no data available today. This work, of course, is of interest for the international communities, in particular for countries who are members or signatories of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which recently entered into force. For the first time, there's an Article 6 on victim assistance and environmental remediation that call for state parties to provide assistance to all communities that were impacted. And part of this assistance is to perhaps engage in a new wave of academic and technical work on this topic. So to conclude, I hope I kind of give you an idea of how technical work, and in particular atmospheric transport and dispersion modeling, enables us to revisit the impact of nuclear testing with significant policy impact today. That there are places where no historical data is available, and we should do our best to estimate population exposure there. And I hope to contribute to this work, but I hope others could join also in this endeavor. And finally, beyond fallout reconstruction, we're at a time of heightened international tension and where the specter of nuclear war is coming back. And of course, when you study nuclear fallouts, you can use archived weather from the 50s, 60s, 70s, or you can use weather from today to understand what would be the radiological consequences on current population and ecosystems should nuclear war or nuclear weapons be used again. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you. And as a reminder, please use the microphone for your comments and questions.
So I'm wondering if at any stage during this process, given that this is different from the other talks we heard before, because this is, you are French and you are basically exposing French actions. So I'm wondering if you've had any experiences from nationalistic or military circles that told you to stop, or threats or anything like that, because this is showing good progress only. So I'm wondering if you had that experience at all.
Yeah, thank you. So the first answer is no. Until we published our work, there was no threats, intervention, or anyone preventing us from doing this work, perhaps surprisingly. No, on the other hand, let me just say it this way. So this work was only possible to do, in my understanding, because I was not a member of French institutions or French universities that would have relied on French government funding to do this type of work. This would have never worked. Yeah. So the only reason I think this was possible to accomplish was, one, I was, yes, a French scientist, so I could read French. Two, I had the experience working on nuclear safety issues and I was understanding what was going on. And three, I was sitting at, a relatively famous institution in the United States, so that helped a lot. There was no pushback, immediate pushback. The first response from the government was silence for about 2 weeks. And then the situation was so dramatic in Polynesia that the overseas minister had to go there for almost 10 days. And then they started negotiating about what would come out of this. And I think the impact became so politically important that the president had to go, and then he made the decision of what to do. And once the president makes decisions about what to do, then the rest of the government, essentially follow suit. So, if I would say there was no pushback, there was some pushback, but never, we still haven't been challenged scientifically on our academic publications, I would say, on academic grounds, yes. And I think part of the reason is because the arguments are so salient that ultimately the government prefers the court to decide what comes out of this and don't want to put all the cards open. Yeah, sorry. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question as well. It follows on, I think, to something that you were just saying. This latest project that you've outlined, which is estimating the worldwide fallout of all nuclear tests you can get data on, given the stakes are so high for governments to respond and have to remediate or compensate, do you imagine getting pushback on the science, and how would you know, right? So one could imagine doing lawsuits based on the modeling that you've already provided. So, for example, countries that have experienced an enormous amount of radiation, like Kazakhstan, who don't appear to be getting compensation at all. There's no mechanism for compensation. Nothing from Russia. That was going to be the question I was going to ask you afterwards, if there's a mechanism from Russia, but that's not the case. Right. Though, in some bright future, when the TPNW is in play, there's this mechanism for compensation that's included. Okay.
Yeah, and why I think it's the case is, software and simulations, all of this is very well established. The kind of, I used iSplit, which is NOAA's flagship, program. It's excellent. Most of our stabilized nuclear kind of source term modeling is based on US fallout codes, partly declassified in the 70s and 80s. All the data that we put as input was measurements from the governments. So essentially, it's really hard to reboot because those are your tools and your facts. So if they're wrong, you can crank up the software as well, but you'll find the same results. For Kazakhstan or, I mentioned China, there are key parameters that you need in those models, and that's where most of the uncertainty is going to be. But there are ways to take those uncertainties into account in that type of modeling, and I hope that we'll be able to tackle this in the next 3 years or so, 4 years, who knows? Yeah.
Yes, I just had a different question, but you made the point that it was very essential that you have independent position and support to be able to do this that was separate from the French academic situation and support. And this reflects, I think, this kind of problem is a worldwide problem that people everywhere in the world need to care about. But in particular, the science is worldwide. And so I'm wondering if, for example, the American Physical Society has resources that it could contribute to advancing these kinds of efforts. And if you thought about that and whether that's something that should be pursued, the APS views itself as a worldwide physics organization, and it may be possible to get additional support for these kind of things produced by activism by APS. Do you see that there's actually more physical science things to be accomplished, or is that not something that's necessary?
No, yes. So the question is, do I think there is, more to be done on the science, and also what role could APS, for example, as an organization, could play here? To the first question, yes, I think there are still very open research questions, and in fact, I believe there is a new wave of work, even within U.S. National Lab, in modeling the dynamics of the creation of the mushroom clouds and how it gets dispersed by the winds. And to answer, and yes, so there are many things we still don't really, we don't have all the capabilities, but let's say to a first order, we can start doing this work, and it has not been done. And having the independent point of view is truly, truly needed, because I think, as Arjun was mentioning, many communities were, especially living near the test site, have lost complete faith into government studies, this is something that is badly needed. Even if you end up validating some of those government studies, because that also happened, but sometimes you also find errors, and this is where things can have certain implication. I think APS could play a role. I think APS could play a role in perhaps, thinking about the legacy of US tests also. We talked about the Marshall Islands today. This work hasn't been done. I'm doing some work already. Others hopefully will do. I can't take on everyone. I don't have the resource to do all of them at once, so it takes time. But I think it is a study that would really benefit from being done, just perhaps only to say what is the state of the literature and what needs to be done, and based on those new tools, working scientists and physicists finally get some answers to all those folks who are impacted. Yeah.
I think it's best to use the microphone. Wait, let's 5 more minutes.
Yeah. So I want to make sure people know that the Forum on Physics and Society will be having its business meeting immediately or shortly after the conclusion of the Q&A for this session. And so we urge you to stay, because after the business meeting, there will also be refreshments, and we're going to be honoring at the business meeting any of the fellowship and awardees who are here, and that's what the refreshments are to celebrate. So please stay.
Yes.
And if you want to ask questions of the panelists, that would be outstanding too.
Yes. So thank you for coming and staying. I think the panelists will make themselves available to speak with you afterwards. I think it's fine if you're welcome to just.
Did you want to have general questions for the panelists?
If we have 5 minutes to do that, that would be great. So they may. Yes, please, if you don't mind.
So all of you, my question was actually for all of them, not just for Sebastian.
Yep.
And that has to do with these, which today would be judged as inappropriate ethical choices that the scientists and government people involved in these tests in real time made to either lie to the public or to suppress or divide or the data, to alter the data they're sharing. Or and in the American Physical Society today, if you find somebody who does that, or if they do it with federal money, you accuse them of research misconduct or ethical violations, and there are consequences. And I imagine this is going on today too. I mean, I'm not so naive as to think that the situation in the past is, behind us and we're all ethical scientists 100% going forward and ethical government officials, and it's a nightmare. But I thought that, raising this aspect of fudging the data or fudging the PR and, altering the reports where when you get the classified data available later, you can get a better idea. So.
So just to repeat the question is, ethical dilemma of scientists perhaps taking part of this type of work
And
at the time.
fudging.
And fudging, yes.
Deliberately, the medical doctor who said,
Yes.
we obviously need to reduce the numbers here.
Yes.
on-
Yes. No, I mean, my reading, and I'll share it with the others, was, it was profoundly unethical, and people knew it already at the time. And then they would give themselves, excuses of, national security imperatives and so on, that then can be perhaps debated, but there was nothing ethical about what was going on, for sure. That's my personal reading of the French part.
Yeah, as I said, there were the racist aspects of it, if I might just be blunt, are, I think I would hope at least some would have seen them as unethical at the time. The officials maybe did, I'll point to the consciousness of the unethical thing from a slightly different arena done by the same institution. As you may know, the United States carried out human experiments, and the Marshall Islands sort of medical work is partly within that also because they were compared, closer to us than the mice. But one of the scientists who participated in designing these experiments, plutonium injections, feeding radioactive cereal to children, pregnant women, experiments on prisoners, most vulnerable populations. Commenting on one of the experiments, I can't remember which one now, he said, and this is in the early 1950s, Beverly, this has a touch of Buchenwald. And this is from one of the people who then, they went on and did the experiments. And when the Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, found out about the plutonium injection experiments through work done by journalists, she says, this reminds me of the Nazis. And of course, that led to the Presidential Commission. So I think some aspects of the ethics were not in doubt. Others, I would agree that, they went ahead and didn't think about the ethics.
So I just wanted to say in general that working with the archival documents, I understood that we shouldn't treat even secret documents that were declassified as written at face value, because at least, the documents I went through, it's clear that there was also deliberate what was mentioned, what was not. Of course, you can deduct a lot, and especially if you confirm from other sources, but just the fact that we have a document from the past doesn't mean that it's the full truth, and that's one. I just want to maybe give a positive story about ethics of the scientists. So that expedition of doctors from Kazakhstan, that was 1958. So at the height of, people really risking not only their job, but life. The head of the expedition, he was warned by his deputy. He said there was a study done in the Soviet Union on when they forced a certain group of people, maybe of Jewish religion, or there was a certain group that was exiled into Siberia. They started dying, and the doctor who did the study and collected clinical data, he ended up in Gulag himself. So when I was researching that story, it was inspiring to me, and I even did an entire TEDx talk based on that, because that's an example of when scientists consciously chose to risk because they understood that keeping silence wasn't an option. And so it's like there are sad or disappointing stories, but I think in every country there are also stories of true courage of scientists and technical experts.
So I just wanted to follow up because I think something that you sort of hinted at, but we do have societies like the Physical Society which stand for ethical behavior and demand it. And to be a person, a physicist in good standing in that society, you cannot do these kinds of things. So I think we need to make use of that as a way to encourage ethical behavior. And I think in many areas we're trying to do that. But I think the societies, the scientific societies, need to make this really, really clear. And that may not make it possible for everyone to take the ethical path, but I think it will make it easier, and it's very important.
Can I make an example of the person who is actually standing here? And that's Sebastian. We were on one panel together, and I asked him, you were kind of part of the establishment before, and how easy was it to make the switch and, kind of end up on the other side? And I'll never forget what Sebastian said. He said, once I saw the documents, I couldn't keep silent. And so to me, that's like the epitome of being an ethical scientist. You see the data, you have to make it visible.
Has any country that has done nuclear testing admitted to what happened and compensated people or really cleared the people out and warned them? Did this happen ever?
Well, as I mentioned, there is compensation in the United States. I'll take it briefly and then pass it on. There is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Some people talk about nuclear justice, but I think they awarded $50,000 initially to downwinders and somewhat more to uranium miners and so on. There was an apology issued by the government to the radiation downwinders. There's not yet one to the Marshall Islanders. And this is item that some of us think should be on the table during these negotiations. And I should say some of us have made an effort to bring it up. The compensation in the Marshall Islands certainly has been entirely inadequate. And we haven't talked much about remediation. You can't really remediate that. And you saw the Runen Dome. There's 120 times more radioactivity in the lagoon. And the lagoons are, of course, part of the traditional economy. So I think a more solid reflection on the nature of the nuclear age and the unethical nature of nuclear weapons, which were designed as weapons of terror, I gave you an indication of that, is necessary on the part of the nuclear weapon states. But I think they're very, very far from that. Some compensation has happened. There's compensation for nuclear weapons workers. It is a struggle for those workers. I've been involved in that. It's a struggle for workers to get that compensation, but there has been some.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, it's simply, and it's time. But there is of course some legislation in the US in France and a little bit in the UK, but again, not, for example, for downwinders from British tests in Australia. There is nothing. So yeah, so there is lots of work to do and still studies to be conducted on those places in particular. And you know, the strategy always was to wait for those folks to die out eventually, and yeah.
And noting there is a fourth generation.
Yeah, so there's a question of transgenerational effect and so on. But even so, when you think about it, I mean, folks were exposed in the 60s or 70s. Some of them probably are in this room, perhaps, I don't know, or in this meeting, you know, if you were a child or born in those years, especially in the US, even, I mean, continental US. The legislation exists, but it's very geographically restricted and actually doesn't at all match the, you know, for example, for iodine doses to the public, most of people were exposed at that time and eventually perhaps possibly could have their thyroid cancer linked. They are not part of the legislation. You would need to essentially compensate the entire country, which, you know, would be a ton of money, sorry.
So on Russia and Kazakhstan, Russia not only doesn't pay any compensation, the Russian legislation only covers Russian citizens, including their atomic veterans. Kazakh legislation covers Kazakh civilians. Russia not only doesn't meet any fault or, you know, provide any compensation, it doesn't even provide some basic data that Kazakhstan has been requesting. So I think for nuclear justice purposes, it's so important that those who perpetrated this nuclear violence at least acknowledge it, but in Russia's case, I don't see it happening anytime soon.